Hey friends, this is a video on small groups for congregations working with the concept of having an open chair in your small groups. So thank you for the person who submitted this question. Now, many congregations have used a model where as they form small groups as part of a larger group-based program for doing spiritual exploration, community building, etc., as they're forming groups, they introduce an idea. This goes way back. Having an open chair in every group so that as you're going about your group program, your group ministry, however you discuss it, there's always a seat so that you can bring newcomers in. And so I want to talk through some of the issues with this and offer my thoughts on how that model of an open chair is an unsophisticated way to address a problem or some challenges in our groups that come about because we're humans who form relationships that actually isn't really sophisticated enough to manage the issue. All right, so imagine this. You have a congregation that has people coming together in small groups. So this is kind of the situation in the congregation we're talking about where groups are formed for a program duration 5 months. So you have a 5-month program, people come together in groups, meet for that period of time, 5 months. So every other week, so around 10 sessions during that semester. Then you have another semester later on in the year. So groups come together, people are put into groups, start building relationships. At the end of the program, groups closed. Now, if you have an open chair in your groups, some congregations will say, all right, we're going to start the groups and we're going to have the open chair so that we can put some newcomers in. Well, what happens is when you're forming groups for kind of a program duration, you might have a period where people can join, but what often happens, and in this case, after you get past a couple sessions, people are like, whoa, we've already started this program. It's too late for you to join. And so there's a real pushback to having people join a group after a certain number of sessions if you're doing kind of like a finite programmatic semester approach. So what I invite you to think about is how do we design a group system that is more organic and designed at the ground level to welcome people in continually? Because the problem with having an open chair in a programmatic semester model is that you're not responding to some of the organic issues that happen with relationships, people getting to know each other, feeling like they've enrolled in this thing that has a start and an end, and you should participate in the start and the end. But in reality, people are coming into congregations at all different times. So we have to have the capacity to welcome people into relationship, into groups at all times. So the open chair is a concept. It's like, oh, we're going to keep an open chair so that we can welcome new people. And like, that's kind of like this Band-Aid approach. The other thing is because as we form relationships and people come together and start getting to know each other very quickly, the relationships and people are like, this is great. Many groups, if you have a healthy group structure, the process works. People feel connected, intimate. They're sharing stories, making friends, and that relational pull pulls the group inward. And it's easy for the group to be like, this is special. Don't mess with my group. This is my community. And all of a sudden, that group doesn't want, it's not really as tied into the larger vision of the congregation, but you have a group of friends or just like very close people who are like, this is my group. Don't mess with it. And it kind of starts being out of touch with the larger system. And so because the natural pull inward of relationships can make groups turn inward, if we don't balance it with vision, mission, leadership development, and other things that open groups and turn them outward, congregations impose an end time for groups. So we actually have the problem, like we're doing a Band-Aid, like, oh, we need to keep groups open somehow. So we'll have an open chair, not that sophisticated, and doesn't really work with all the models we're using. And then, oh, groups keep turning inward and becoming more clique-like. How can we address that problem? Leadership development, no. Having more vision and mission focus and more training and talking about groups in our worship services, nah. Let's just cut the groups off after so many months. All right, so some problems. So what does a more organic approach look like? So I want you to look at this. All right, think about your group system, and I'll just note that some of the questions that came in to me were like, what do I think about extending the group, the period of time that people can join groups once kind of like a 5-month program starts? I think if you're doing that model, you're kind of locking yourself into groups are starting, and that program starting, you've kind of set yourself up for the group starts, it's going to run for a semester and end. You should really form those groups and not expect them to be very open once the groups get underway. Instead, we need to have different kinds of groups, I think. So I want you to think about the system you create within your congregation for like bringing people in, forming community, getting people in community groups, doing spiritual exploration, whatever the goals of your group program are. Think of it like a living system. In this case, I'll say like a tree, all right? So we're trying to grow this system that is strong, sturdy, alive, flexible, and growing, and can always at any time welcome people in. So continual growth. It's healthy. It's able to deal with challenges, the storm, whether it's ministerial transition, other conflicts in the world, just the justice issues we're facing. That this is just like amazing living system. People network together in healthy small groups, living out the mission, vision, and purpose of your congregation. Now, if you think about a living system, here's a little vine. You have the core of the tree or a vine. When you look at it, the majority of it is kind of like this harder, woody, not as rigid like core. But then towards the tip, do I have a pointer? Let me see if I have a pointer here. There we go. So down here is like all this woody part, but then near the tip, you have like this growth tip where it's more green, it's more flexible, and at the very, very tip, that's where groups, where cells are growing, dividing, and there's like just like tons of new cells being formed. And then right after that super growth tip, you have the more newer green flexible, and over time what happens? It settles into like this more locked down woody structure. Now for us, I want you to think about the cells of that vine or plant being like the cells in your group system, your groups. And so if we look at these, think of these as small groups. If you put a bunch of people in your congregation together, they are going to form relationships, and over time, they're going to come to care for each other. They're going to want to support each other. They'll know each other's stories, and they're not going to want to stop meeting with each other because they have really valuable relationships. So they are going to become less flexible about bringing newcomers in because they've formed this core structure within their group. Like, these are our relationships. The more locked in those relationships get, the stronger, the more valuable. These are my friends, less flexibility. Now, does that mean those relationships aren't valuable? No, they're incredibly valuable. In fact, it's long-term groups where people have long-term relationships where the deepest, most significant caring, support, ministry happens. And so I actually say, by cutting groups off into just semesters, that is an unsophisticated response to relationships pulling inward and actually growing strong. So you need to work, even if you might do a semester model, but you need to put on your agenda, how do we make space within our group system for long-term groups, and how do we support long-term groups so that they're healthy? And so all of a sudden you're thinking, wait a second, how do we do that? Well, you need to stop treating all groups the same. So you might have groups that are more like, hey, these are people who've been in our groups, say like these more woody, not as flexible groups. These are people who've been meeting for years. They're stable, they're valuable, they're caring for each other. Well, what do we need to do to make sure those groups are healthy? They're in communication with our leadership. They're still, working on the same, whatever the content is that those groups are doing, whether you're using prepared session plans, what's happening in those groups are still on mission for your group program or group-based ministry. And there's communication with your leadership. Maybe you don't need as much communication with the leaders of those groups and say that the leaders of this program, this group ministry, because they've been doing it for years. But you have to be communicating enough to make sure what's happening within the group is still on mission, and it's not their group, it's the congregation's group, and it's part of a program. We can talk more about what happens if groups get to the point where they're not on mission and have drifted or evolved to have a different focus. We could get there. All right, so many of the smaller congregations, just the majority of congregations in the world, like under 200 members, I see trying to just use treat all groups the same. And they'll be like, all right, every group needs to be meeting and welcoming newcomers. And so it's like this flexible thing. I think what is more helpful is to think about, all right, we have long-term stable groups. We might need to have groups that are designed to be in semesters so that people who are only able to commit to that can sign on. Like, when I've led groups, I've led groups that continue forever. They're meeting every other week, never ending. And we're always welcoming new people into the group. And because that's something that I'm passionate about. And when we get to the point where the group's growing and there's more interest to get into that group because it's a rockin' group, what happens? Well, I'm actually, as the leader, working with other leaders in the group to get them set up to take over that group. And I would then go on to start a brand new group. And so you end up, like, I'm the kind of person who would be leading, you might call it like a turbo growth group, where my group's absolutely committed to making sure anyone who steps foot in that congregation or connects with us online, who's like, hey, I want to connect with this congregation, that we're going to make space for them. And I, as the leader of that group, in collaboration with the leadership of the congregation, like, we know, like, all right, my group, my ongoing group is always welcoming new people. And that is part of my charge and my mission as someone who is leading the growth tip of this system, of this vine. All right. So I think you can find and cultivate people who can do that for you. And they will be like, yes, I would love to lead a group that is ongoing, or maybe even like, no, I'm going to lead a 5-month semester. But in this group, we're welcoming people all the time. And people who join that group know that this is like a super welcoming, newcomer-oriented component of this larger system. And then you have people who are like, all right, very prone to newcomers, welcoming them. And then, so like, you could say, if you set aside the whole semester approach and think about having ongoing groups, which I actually think there's value to, you might say, like, all right, we're having these groups, we're never going to shut them down, because these more stable, like deep, long-term groups, people have known each other for years, you're not shutting those down. Why would you shut those down? You have to make sure they're healthy. But otherwise, why shut them down? All right. Then we need to have groups that are forming. People are having the opportunity to build relationships. Now, maybe you have a program where there's semesters, people can opt in for that. I think it's also good to think about within your congregation, if the goal is to connect people in groups and have community, have people get oriented to congregational life, it's very helpful to have group-based experiences that from the time people want to connect with your congregation, they're able to move into relationship with the congregation, and that there's really a newcomer welcoming orientation and connecting function that's happening within groups, so that at the very, the growth oriented part of your system is actually part of your welcoming, hospitality, orienting, and connecting people to the congregation. Don't think that like all the groups are doing the exact same thing. You might have a chunk of your groups that's actually, oh, this is a core aspect of our welcoming people into our community. When people, they sign up for a newcomer event, which is a group-based experience, and maybe it's a single session where people can get questions asked, but they get a little taste of how you run groups, just in terms of the size, some of the structure, the ritual, however you do it. People who are interested in continuing, move them into a shorter term. Maybe it's a 4-week or 4-session starter group experience where you're going through, there's almost like a membership class, right? So you have a group-based membership class or just newcomer experience that's designed to connect people, give them a group experience, and get them to the point where if they like that, they are able to move into your next, whenever if you're doing semesters, move people into the next semester. So, because I know our friend who asked this question is using a 5-month semester a couple times a year. If you have 5-month program, if newcomers are coming in and they're not in sync with when the start times are, what do we want to do? We want to get them into some kind of group experience. So having a newcomer group or a series of groups, you can welcome people in, orient them, connect them, and maybe have it be clear that's like, oh, we are gathering people together. We have newcomer groups. There's a certain number of groups, and it's growing, the number, where newcomers are coming in. Peter and these other people are leading a whole cluster of groups. It could be online using Zoom, where we're welcoming people, doing introductions, introducing group session topics, and then breaking into breakout groups and having all the newcomers who are coming into the system out of sync with your semesters. We're doing this multi-group experience for newcomers so that they're having an amazing experience. They're meeting other leaders in the congregation who are more established, really getting integrated into the life of the congregation and the group system. And they have a place to be where, like, all right, as you start moving towards your next 5-month start, or like the start of that program, you can say, all right, those of you, like, we're going to take people who've been in our newcomer oriented group experience, and we're going to form some new groups. Some of you can join existing groups. We're going to take some of the people who've been in our newcomer group, and if you're ready to do a 5-month commitment, then we'll form a group with you. And so turbo groups and newcomer groups, feeding people, holding them, caring for them, supporting them in a newcomer optimized way, and getting them ready to then move into your group system, which could be semester. And then ultimately, no matter what you do, if you're doing semesters or not, just know that if the goal is to connect people through relationship, engage in spiritual reflection, etc. I often say, don't start relationships that you're going to ask people to end if those relationships are the things that are going to keep people connected to your congregation. Like, why would you bring people into small groups and say, you're not following our rules for gathering because you want to keep being friends? Well, you can go and meet unofficially. A lot of congregations do that. They say, all right, we're going to set up some boundaries to limit the problems that come from groups that aren't led in led in terms of like a healthy, dynamic way, being tied to the vision and mission of the congregation and supported by the congregation's leaders. So they're like, all right, we're going to have an arbitrary cutoff, 5 months, whatever it is, 1 year. Some congregations do 1 year. And they say, all right, end of the year, you need to break up. Group's over. And those people are like, these are my friends. And they end up creating rogue groups, going underground and meeting in ways that are even less tied to what the congregation is doing. And so you see the problem there? So make sure that, I would say, if you have people who want to keep meeting, know that, like, all right, here's how we're treating long-term groups, keeping them tied to the system so that they're healthy, on mission, working with our group process, content, etc. And then knowing that, all right, we have these different aspects of the system. You can't have the tree, without the trunk, right? And so I think it's important that you just know that a one-size-fits-all approach to managing groups is not sophisticated enough for the kind of system we need to be cultivating. Now, there are some other kinds of groups that we get where, let me turn off the pointer. There are times when groups are not as interested in having newcomers come in, doing whatever the focus of your program is. Let me just talk about those quickly. So sometimes you have a group, let's go over here, where it's like, we're a special group. You can't tell us what to do. You can't add newcomers. It's like, this is special. So sometimes what happens is people who are not used to being in relationship with others in the significant way that happens in facilitated small groups, they're like, this is magic. Do not mess with my group. And so they're holding on to what is perceived as something precious that could be ruined. So we can communicate with them about how this happens continually in our small groups, that magic happens through our facilitated small group experience. It's fantastic. And that it's important that you keep the group, as long as the group is going to be part of this core congregational system, it's important that certain things happen. Like maybe you're worried that the dynamic of the group is going to change if we add anyone new to the group. Well, maybe you talk about whether or not it's appropriate for that group to have newcomers come in. But you need to assess that group. Like, is it pushing back against what you're trying to do with the whole network of groups, your system of groups, or is it because that group is unhealthy? Sometimes we get leaders where a couple of facilitators who totally click, they like each other, and they're kind of forming this little community and culture that doesn't like what's happening in the congregation, and it's becoming this inward focused group of people who are actually working against the vision of the larger congregation. So again, we need to assess that. But that's not the type of thing where you can say, all right, here's what's happening in the whole group system. This group is not wanting to play by the rules exactly, or is pushing back. You can't assume that, like, is this an unhealthy group? Maybe these people are like forming just like great long-term relationships, and they need to be moved into like a stable and valuable group category, and figure out what's the best way to communicate with them so that they can continue meeting, stay on mission, but maybe aren't doing some of like the growth and outreach work. The other thing that happens is sometimes you get people come together and the interests of the people in that group are aligned in some way, and sometimes it's because the leader has a specific content focus or spiritual exploration they want to do, whatever, that is a little different than what your full group system is about. And so that group evolves a little different focus, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, and it has morphed into a different kind of group than your larger group system. And then we need to say, or can say, all right, is what's happening there valuable for those people? Is it really in line with the mission of our congregation? Or is this evolved into something that has nothing to do with our congregation anymore? In which case, there's a conversation to be had. Oh, you know what? You've actually, using our group system, have somehow managed to come up with this group, which is this great program, but it's not a program of the congregation, even though it started out because of the coming together that happened through the group system. Or maybe you're like, ooh, this is a great thing, but it's a different kind of a group than our core small group system. So we should really call it something else and figure out how it fits into the programming of the congregation. All right, does it make sense? All right, I hope that's helpful. For me, the most important thing is you can't treat all groups the same long term if you're going to grow the system to the point where you have longer term healthy relationships, people supporting each other in the hardest seasons of life. If you're forcing people to stop after so many sessions and don't allow them to continue, it's hard to form the relationships where we're going to be around each other's bedside when one of our friends is at the end of their life. There's real significant ministry that happens because of long-term groups. But we have to make sure we have a way for newcomers to come in, and I think actually designing newcomer-focused groups and identifying leaders who care about that, and having that newcomer focus, your core groups, a little more flexible, and then knowing that there's going to be longer term groups. And we have to treat the leaders of those groups a little differently. I think we can come up with a few categories. Be strategic, get the value from all of them, celebrate, honor the ministry, the work, the relationships that's happening in those different kind of groups, and not use a one-size-fits-all approach. A little complicated, complex, but valuable. All right, hope that helps. If you're dealing with related questions, please feel free to reach out to me, because I'm working on my next small group training on demand masterclass in small groups for congregations.